This is the Project TT225, and over the course of the past few weeks, I've been on a quest to upgrade almost every aspect of this car's suspension. As of right now, this car has fully adjustable control arms on the front and the rear, as well as front and rear upgraded sway bars. We've added so much configurability to this car's suspension that we're finally ready for coilovers. At the end of the last suspension episode, you may have noticed that we broke our ball joint for one of the end links. Thankfully, these came in along with the coilovers. This was also the perfect opportunity to get new strut mounts, bearings, and hardware. There is a myriad of options when it comes to upgrading suspension, and specifically, there's a ton of different coilovers to choose from. They also range heavily in price. These are nowhere near as expensive as you can go for coilovers, so there definitely are better options if your pockets are a little bit deeper. These aren't entry-level either. This kit from Bilstein or Bilstein, depending on where you are in the world, is fantastic value for money. They've got a lifetime warranty, and besides that, the name Bilstein has a lot of history in the suspension department. To say they pretty much invented the monotube shock wouldn't actually be an overstatement. In 1956, they were the manufacturer that helped get the patent working with the French inventor for the monotube shock. Just 2 years later, Mercedes was the first company to put that type of technology into production vehicles. And now look how ubiquitous that technology is. That's a pretty crazy amount of history, and it's part of the reason I opted for this kit. I also picked up white line adjustable end links and 034 Motorsports upgraded strut mounts. When doing suspension, it's always a good idea to have spring compressors in case you need them, but I ordered all the hardware so that I won't even have to use them. Just in case, it's always good to have a set though. These are adjustable Bilstein coilovers, and first and foremost, their colors are incredible to look at. The camera doesn't do them justice. Another thing that makes these just so much cooler is they are TÜV certified. This isn't something I have to worry about in the States, but it's nice knowing that they are safety rated. I've put countless hours into working on the suspension over the course of the past few weeks, all with the goal of throwing these on properly. I've been looking forward to these for a very, very long time, and I think it's time we get them on the car. Once I got the car up on jack stands, I went ahead and familiarized myself with the instructions that came with this, although I couldn't actually read them. Well, that doesn't help, these are in German. Thankfully, coilovers are an incredibly simple install. Starting with the passenger front wheel, I went ahead and unclipped the brake lines from the strut. I also went ahead and undid the sway bar end link. I'm replacing this end link, so I'm going to keep it attached at the top of the strut and just undo the bottom.
Good thing we bought these, because that one's bad too.
The last thing that's in the way on this side is another brake line, however this one has a bracket that's bolted onto the strut. Now that this is free, there's literally just one bolt at the bottom of the strut that you need to undo. We're going to need to take off the ball joint that we replaced a few episodes ago so we can drop the spindle low enough to remove the actual strut. Now that this is dropped, we have enough clearance to put a strut spreader in the back of the spindle, allowing us to remove the strut from the car. Once I got the strut disconnected from the spindle, I reconnected the lower ball joint so that it had some sort of support. Now the only thing holding this strut in is the top nut that you can get to through the top of the engine bay. I guess that's one way to take it out. Now that it's out of the car, let's take a look at these two side by side. They follow the same shape, although the new one looks a lot better and is adjustable. We're not quite ready to install it though. Here's where you would need to use spring compressors to get the factory slim nut off the old struts to reuse on your coilovers. This holds the bearing and the strut mount on the top of the strut. I'm replacing every part of that system, so I don't actually have to do that. I just put the new parts on and in the correct order. To me, it made sense to replace everything. I'm going to torque the top nut and everything down when it's actually in the car, so for now, things are mostly just loosely in there. Removing the stock suspension was easy, but installing the new suspension is even easier. Installing this is literally just as simple as doing everything we just did to remove the old piece in reverse order. I'm using a jack to push the spindle up onto the coilover, and this just allows for more precise and controlled upward force. Once it's up far enough, you can remove the strut spreader. This is going to cause it to clamp down on the coilover. After this, I started reinstalling the rest of the lines. One thing to note is I had the top bolt in the top of the engine bay loosely holding the coilover in place. This is just so it doesn't fall out the bottom. I also went ahead and used a jack to get everything up to ride height and torque things down this way. We'll double check all the torque specs when it gets back on the ground, but for now, this is as good as it gets. The coilover is in place, and now all we need to do is add my new adjustable end link for the sway bar. We need this because these coilovers sit at a lower than factory ride height and they're height adjustable. The stock sway bar end links are designed for stock ride height vehicles, and since we're changing that, we're putting an incorrect amount of pressure on the sway bar. This now being adjustable allows us to control the preload. That is one wheel down, and now it's time to do the front on the other side.
I don't want to put pressure on the sway bar end link, so I ended up disconnecting the bottom. We'll connect it when the car's on ramps.
Working on cars is kind of funny in the sense that everything is mirrored. It often takes a lot longer to do a job the first time than it does to do it again the second time. I've always found this really amusing. I can't think of a better example of this phenomena than working on a suspension like this. In this case, doing the coilover on the driver's side took less than half the time it did on the other side. It's really cool to see how quickly you can pick something up and adapt to a new process. It's one of my favorite parts of working on cars, actually. The only other thing that you're going to want to keep an eye out for on this side is the ride height level sensor. It's not really going to get in the way, but you may want to disconnect it if you think you need to drop the lower control arm enough that it's going to be damaged. I used a jack to mimic the ride height for this side of the car, and that's how I determined the length that I wanted the sway bar end links to sit at. I wanted to have no preload on the sway bar, and I know this won't be perfect, but we'll remedy this when we get the suspension tuned. The front coilovers are on the car, and now it's time to take a second and admire our work. This will be the first time we get to see all the special suspension pieces we put on the past few weeks sitting on the car. The suspension setup is a considerable upgrade over the stock suspension layout. Every piece is all shiny and new, and I just love it. These are height adjustable coilovers, but I'm not going to mess with any of that just yet. Their base height is still lower than the factory ride height, so I want to make sure everything is broken in on them before we get too far into adjusting ride height.
Well, the front of the car is now lowered. Now we got to work on the rear. The coilovers come with a preset height based on the springs. I'm just using that for the time being. We're going to set the height when we get the car suspension tuned, and likely after we get the rest of them on.
The roads where I live are by no means perfect, and honestly, there are so many potholes it's not even funny, so I don't want to slam the car. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I want to lower the car just as much as I need to maximize the benefits of having the lower center of gravity. My goal is to maximize handling, not maximize looks. Even by just lowering the car with the preload of the new coilovers, we have reduced our wheel gap in half, and that is definitely a good start. It was now time for me to start working on the rear suspension of the car, and boy, if you thought the front suspension was simple, the rear is even easier. Here is a quick lay of the land. You've got your spring that sits on your rear trailing arm. Then you have a shock that connects to the rear spindle and the rear of the car. And that's it. Those are the two things we're replacing in the rear. To replace these, the first step is to remove the wheel liner. With the wheel liner removed, we can see the top bolt of the shock. There are literally two bolts in this assembly that we care about, so we're going to start by taking out the bottom one. One thing to note is this one also runs through the sway bar end link. It's a good idea to support the weight of the spindle when you remove this bolt because it's going to fall down. At that point, the spring is just sitting there and you can just pull it out. I thought this was pretty funny and you might enjoy it. Normally when you press shocks down like this, they return to their original position.
I'm glad I'm replacing these.
Just like the front suspension, I followed the directions in the book to go through the way that I set up the rear spring. I set the bottom spring mount on, and then I went ahead and put on the actual spring. After this, I went ahead and bolted up the top of the shock. We're going to need to reuse our friend the jack to get the spindle up to ride height before we thread any of the bolts in. As you're jacking the car up, you're going to want to have the top mount of the spring put in place so that it actually goes into the factory position. You can just lift all this up by hand, although a jack makes it a lot easier. At this point, I'm also threading in my new sway bar end link. I'm not worrying about the length of it right now, I'm just caring about getting the bottom into the right position. I simply set the length of the adjustable sway bar end link to be just long enough to get the bolt into the proper orientation. Then I threaded it through the shock and everything was now in place on this side. A lot of these bolts back here need to be tightened at ride height, so I used a jack to mimic that. It's not perfect, but it's good enough for now. I reinstalled the wheel liner and now the rear of this side is entirely done. Harking back to what I said about doing the same job the second time being a lot faster, the rear of the car is no exception. I think genuinely doing this side of the rear suspension took 25 minutes. So I can definitely say that this is a fantastically easy install with a lot of benefits. But what actually are those benefits and why would I spend all my time doing this? That's actually pretty simple. Coilovers enable a lot more flexibility in your suspension. So what do I really mean by that? Not only can you adjust your overall stance or level out different heights in the front and rear of your car, not to mention adjustable dampening, but these have different rebound rates which allow them to respond differently in a corner. They help your car shift its weight better and handle itself in a much more composed manner. Probably the biggest benefit of the coilovers is the potential for suspension tuning, which allows us to have a lot more input into how the car feels. Adjusting the different tensions in the front and rear, and specifically, we can adjust it wheel by wheel depending on how the car sits. When we get all this adjusted, this will literally make the car feel as neutral as it possibly can. Not to mention, these parts are absolutely gorgeous, and in combination with everything else we've done to the suspension, it is just awesome. It's been a long time coming and I've put a lot of work into this. I then lowered the car back to ride height and I was already happy with how it was looking, but I knew that after a few days of sitting, it would actually get a little lower as the suspension broke itself in. So I'll come back to the car in a few days and give you more of my thoughts. My appointment for suspension tuning is still a few weeks out, so at this point,
we're gonna go get a basic alignment on the TT so I can drive it around and actually see what the coilovers did. Since we've done so much work on the suspension, it's actually been a while since the TT's been properly aligned, so now we're gonna get a good feel for what the mods actually did. In a few weeks, when we actually suspension tune the car and my appointment comes up, we're gonna maximize these modifications and get the car properly set up and corner balanced. Well, she made it to the alignment shop just fine. I don't want to speak too soon because it's not aligned, but I think we made a good choice in upgrading the suspension. It feels a lot different. I'll go more into detail on that once I actually drive the car after it's actually been aligned. It's the next morning, actually, much to my dismay. Believe it or not, they actually couldn't align the car at the last place because it wouldn't go up the ramps to get on the alignment rack. That's kind of annoying. I knew that was going to be potentially a problem, so they sent us to a different location of theirs that has a flat rack. Today, we're actually
actually getting the car aligned. It's been driving fine though. I haven't driven it that much, but I've really enjoyed it so far. Thankfully, this location had zero trouble aligning the TT with the new suspension, and here are the results of what they found. The negative camber on all the wheels makes a lot of sense since we lowered the car and kept our adjustable control arms at the old factory lengths. That's a major benefit of these adjustable control arms being on the car. We're able to get proper alignment values and maintain the lower ride height. For now, we've got a general alignment that's good enough to drive the car as much as we really want. We're obviously going to have more aggressive alignment values after we get suspension tuned, and the car's probably going to handle better then too, but this is perfect for some spirited driving to test out these suspension mods. If I had to use one word to describe how I think this car feels after upgrading all of the suspension like we did, the word would be planted. Seriously though, I feel like this car is on rails now. All the parts we put on the suspension play an integral role into how this car feels. And you can tell that each part's there. The front and rear sway bars make the car feel neutral in a corner. The center of rotation feels like it's directly under the stick shift. This feels a lot closer to the center of the car than before we had done anything to the suspension. The car is also incredibly lively when diving into a corner, and I attribute all of that to replacing the lower front control arm. In the control arm episode, I went into a lot of detail on how the old style front control arms were geared to create understeer. Our tubular front control arm fixes this, and that is only exaggerated with the coilovers themselves. The car is so eager to dive into a corner, and it's honestly enthralling. You can feel the rear control arms when you're powering out of a corner, and you feel the tail end whip around and catch up to the front of the car. The whole time, however, you never feel like it's going to step out or lose grip because of how balanced everything seems to be. These coilovers do a fantastic job in spreading the weight and load of the vehicle. They feel extremely sorted in a corner, and they are incredibly confidence-inspiring. It almost feels like the car is rolling into a corner rather than rolling away from it as you take the turn. It's really hard to put into words, but it is incredibly fun. And the crazy thing is, these feelings are only going to get better when we get the car suspension tuned. That honestly blows me away and makes me so excited. I'll be sure to keep you guys updated on how I feel about the suspension and if any of my thoughts changed in the next TT episode. Seriously, thank you for taking time out of your day to watch my video. It really does mean the world to me. And a special thanks to everybody who watched all the TT suspension episodes and enjoyed this entire journey. If you enjoyed the video or learned something, or just want to support me, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. It's one of the best ways you can help support me and my channel. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next episode, and I hope you have a wonderful day.